Pelle Neroth Taylor, live from Sweden, on today's News Talk, The Pulse. Get your favorite merchandise from our official The Pulse shop. You'll find exclusive online t-shirts, mugs, hats, hoodies, and more at Pulse.today.
When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high, and don't be afraid of the dark.
Pelle Neroth Taylor, live from Sweden, on today's News Talk, The Pulse.
Welcome to the Pelle Neroth Taylor Show. We've got Jens Sörensen with us, who's a professor of peace and development studies at the University of Gothenburg. And the topic is censorship. Well, censorship in the broader sense. I am one of my regular guests and a friend who's called Tuomas Malinen, who's a Finnish professor. He was stabbed in the chest a couple of days ago when he was in a nightclub in Helsinki. Now, he's been a very vocal, perhaps Finland's most vocal critic of Finland's adhesion to NATO and the warmongering that he thinks the Finnish elites, whom he knows well. I think he was an assistant to the current foreign minister, and he never ceases to rail at them from the comforts of X. Well, internet things have real life consequences, and he thinks he might have missed his heart by a few centimeters. He doesn't want to talk about it too much, but he did show up a bloodied photograph of his white, elegant shirt. Who was it? Was it an accident? You can never tell with these things. You know, people do get stabbed for other reasons. You might have had a drink or two or something and then got into fight with the knife-loving Finns or something. But it could also be a Ukrainian guy has been paid off or something, just bump into this guy. But unfortunately, if that's the case, it's part of a much wider trend where opposition voices to the war are silenced in one way or another. We've had people like Craig Murray, who's been in jail for contempt of court. And there's a list of other people. We've had half of them on this show, actually. But we're going to talk a little bit about the EU censorship is mostly of a softer kind, or relatively softer than physical attacks. We've seen a couple of EU journalists being censored for covering the Russia side from a neutral or positive aspect, and I think that they had their bank accounts seized, which means they can't operate, they can't be paid, they can't really function in the modern Europe, and I think they've been banned from returning to their home countries. In two cases, it's Germany. Welcome to the show, Jens.
Thanks for inviting me, Pelle. It's always good to talk. And I'm sorry to hear this about the Finnish colleague. I didn't know that.
He's it's. Do you think European democracy and European censorship, European freedom is in a good or bad state at the moment?
I think it's very obvious that it's in a really bad state. And I think you mentioned. There are several levels. You talked about violence. And it's an old thing. We know that there is a death list set up. It's called Mirotvorets, I think it's called. It actually means peacemaking or peace in Ukrainian. Anyone can look it up with the names, and then they spot them out when they have killed people. And this is financed by Western sources. So it's run by the Minister of Interior in Ukraine and financed by aid money from the United States, and you have Western, including Americans, on those lists. So, that's on the worst level. The other thing you mentioned was journalists being censored, and we could mention, how does that work? There was recently a program by Pascal Lotas, who runs the channel Neutrality Studies on YouTube, about some new German journalists being censored. And the interesting thing is that what is happening is you have decrees issued or council decisions issued by, in the EU without reference to any law. There is no legal process involved. There is no prosecution or judge or any court involved. No reference to any laws or anything. It's just a council decision signed off by Kaja Kallas in this case, and they simply write down the names of journalists who have dissenting voices, and then these journalists are on a sanction list together with a number of Russians, of course, and they have their accounts seized. They cannot have bank accounts. They cannot get salaries paid. They cannot pay their bills. They cannot. Travel bans are also imposed on them and so on. And this is a classical, it's like a Politburo decree. It's like a dictatorial decree. There is no rule of law involved. There is no legal process. This is how a dictatorship works. And this is the EU. So any member country of the EU is thereby directly under this. And we have had for decades discussions. Political scientists have talked about the EU for decades as having a democratic deficit. They've been very aware of the problems with democracy, but it's misconstruing the problem, because the EU doesn't have a democratic deficit. It's designed to be anti-democratic, and we see it now in full bloom. And of course, you don't discover it if you never say anything dissenting. If you just go about your business, you mind your own garden, then you will not encounter this, and you can still believe it's democracy. But if you can have these kind of council decisions issued, then that's directly countering anything democratic.
Yeah,
and you could say, sorry, if I just want to say continue. You could say, what is democracy then? Well, it's not a digital situation. It's not an either or. It's not black or white. So in Sweden, for example, and I think probably in the UK and many other countries, in school, you have some sort of idea you should train the kids in democratic thinking. And that means that ahead of summer, they can all vote where they will travel on the school trip. Do you want to go to the fun fair, or do you want to go to the zoo? And then the students will say, we all want to go to the fun fair. And then they do that by democratic decision. Or they can have a vote whether they should have new ice hockey, well, that's in Sweden, maybe new football goals on the schoolyard, or basketball goals. And they'll vote and they'll get that. But they cannot vote about the curriculum, or about what time they will start school, or what teachers they will have, or anything else. So it's like an upscaled school democracy, you could say, that you have. Municipal democracy. But the EU is now openly censoring and actively censoring individual citizens of EU member states.
And we know that Kaja Kallas, I mean, she comes from a country of 1 million people, and that's like 0.2% of the EU's population. And she has very strong views about Russia, not shared by a lot of people. I mean, if you're an Italian or a Spaniard, and those ministers of those countries have complained that Kaja Kallas doesn't really represent their views, and she can sign off on this. And ironically, her father was a communist. I mean, Siim Kallas was a senior communist apparatchik in Estonia in the communist time, and they lived well and so on. And now she's behaving like that. It's really terrible. And I love the way you drew that parallel with the fact that it's a school, because you get this kind of I'm on Facebook, unfortunately, but at least I get to see what they want the people to think. And there's European Parliament has a lot of money at its disposal, because I always get their adverts, and it's always about democracy, you choose, and so on. And yeah.
Now, about the money, the EU is spending now more money on what they call misinformation management. They're spending more money on that than they do on cancer research. about 650 million euros. There is no demand for this. This is just narrative control, and it's sponsoring think tanks and also academics to sort of seek out what could be misinformation or disinformation, information that is deemed dangerous for people to hear or see.
Well, misinformation, can you explain that? Or malinformation, they introduce all these categories that sound like it's wrong. They sound as if they're rooting out lies, but the way they define these things is like they're only rooting out things that they'd happen not to like. So it's a kind of sleight of hand in the way they define the words malinformation or misinformation, isn't there?
Yeah, it goes counter to the whole idea, to the whole classical political liberal idea that, free information, free circulation of information is important to, for opinion making and for democratic functioning and so on, communicative action or whatever you want to call it. Here it's about controlling information and labeling certain information as dangerous or so it's about narrative control.
But I mean, malinformation, isn't that defined as information that's not necessarily wrong but makes us look bad? I mean, I'm not saying it in the words they would say, but basically, it's not inaccurate information. It's a view that is kind of threatening to the body politic or the institution, and that's completely against the Enlightenment. I mean, malinformation, and as said, they don't define it, so they'll use the word malinformation, and people think, oh, they're just rooting out lies, but they're not doing that. They've redefined the word disinformation or misinformation and malinformation. It's all confusing, and it allows them still to pose as guardians of democracy when they're anything but. Were you a pro-European, or were you always Eurosceptic?
I was a Eurosceptic from the beginning for various reasons, but it was a very different time, of course. When the vote in Sweden was, we didn't vote for a political or military bloc. Nobody did. We just ended up we voted for some sort of, customs union, and then we ended up in the Warsaw Pact, in the new version of it.
Warsaw, I mean, exactly. I mean, I'm going to give the boot to the East European states who've been put on a pedestal in a way. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe in the early 1990s, and you wouldn't spend 5 minutes with a Pole before they said Yalta. And I actually I'd heard of Yalta, but I mean, if you're a estate agent or a stag-nighter turning up in Gdansk, you probably wouldn't have heard of Yalta, but it was always Yalta, this Operation Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that betrayal, this. And so there's an enormous guilt trip that we're supposed to be on, and we had to save the East Europeans because they sacrificed themselves, and then you had communism and all the rest of it. So they allowed to join. But what did they bring to the table? I mean, they've sucked in all these cohesion funds for decades. Okay, they've provided open markets, but they've also brought with their ancestral hatreds, and they're using us as a baton to beat their old enemies, the Russians. I mean, the Spaniards and the Italians think, what the hell is this? We didn't sign up for this. Why are we fighting the Polish, the Polish border wars? Because, Belarus and Ukraine were at one point part of the sort of Polish Empire or the Commonwealth, and Lithuania, of course. And then the Swedes, you've got the Swedish elite thinking that they're Charles XII fighting revenge for the Battle of Poltava. Most people didn't sign up for this at all. But I have to say, I was quite Europhile for a long time. I spent time in Brussels, and I was just enchanted by the policy debates that were going on. But in a way, now when I'm thinking back of it, everyone was pro-European to different degrees, except Nigel Farage. But he was so vulgar. He was like swearing in church that even I thought, he's not it took me a long while to realize that he's onto something, but now finally I have. And I used to hang out with his people because he was it was publisher or something of a magazine called The Sprout, which is like a private eye of Brussels, and I used to hang around those people. They never asked me that I was pro-European. They didn't bother about that, but they were very, very anti-European. And now I have to take my hat off and realize they were 20 years ahead of their time. We're just going to go into a very quick break. We'll be back after the break.
Get your favorite merchandise from our official The Pulse shop. You'll find exclusive online t-shirts, mugs, hats, hoodies, and more at thepulse.today.
Abel.
I often forget to mention that he's an amputee because Abel will try any activity he can.
My arm helps me with basically everything.
He doesn't see what he can't do, he sees what he can do.
Yeah, this is helping.
The War Amps has just given him the ability to do all the activities every kid can do.
When you donate to the War Amps, you help kids like me. Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Lance Bass, and this is CHIP. For more than 100 years, American Humane has been on the front lines protecting animals in times of crisis. From Pearl Harbor to 9/11, the California wildfires, and the coronavirus pandemic, American Humane Rescue has provided life-saving assistance for animals in virtually every major national disaster. If you're anything like me, your pets mean the world to you. And if disaster strikes, you want to keep them safe. To prepare for an oncoming disaster, ensure your pet has secure and up-to-date identification. And if you must evacuate, remember to take your disaster preparedness kit with you. To learn more about disaster planning and how to keep your best friends safe, please visit AmericanHumane.org.
Today's news. The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
Without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, it's a legal thing, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Free speech has a home. Today's News Talk, The Pulse.
Welcome back to the Pelle Neroth Taylor show. We've got Jens Sörensen, who's with the University of Gothenburg, a friend, a returning guest. Today, we talked about many geopolitical topics, but today we're covering the EU censorship industrial complex. Incredible that it's 600 million euros to do public diplomacy, isn't it? I mean, how many newsrooms couldn't that fund? You know, but I guess can I ask you a little bit about your? Are you allowed to talk about your students? Are they pro-European or Eurosceptic? And do you teach them about? Do you give them warning signs about what you hold up the European Union as a warning example of democracy turned into sort of authoritarianism?
No, I actually don't teach much of that, but I want to say one thing about the pro-European, because I think it's before or parallel to the EU, or when it was the EEC, there was, of course, the European Free Trade Agreement, the EFTA countries. And I was always sort of pro-free trade. And I think the term pro-European should be against the EU, because I think the EU and NATO are the two iron cages that were presented as a solution to a problem at one time in history, but they have actually become the iron cages now that is destroying Europe in different ways, and it's against the people of Europe. So I think pro-European would be trying to dismantle the EU because it's unreformable, and there are many regional organizations and regional corporations that function very well without becoming military blocs or political unions of an authoritarian kind. There is the ASEAN, there is the Ancerta, there is the Eurasian Economic Union, there is the BRICS, and so on. So you have a lot of regional free trade agreements and cooperation agreements that does not try to become authoritarian political blocs that also become militarized against a neighbor.
Well, I mean, it seems that this militarization of Europe, I mean, that they're going to borrow off the backs of the assets of the nation states and coordinate a sort of gigantic buying program, and then invest in European military industry as a substitute for the net zero, and a way to, of course, it's a way to make the EU relevant. But in a way, first of all, they're going to be buying mostly American weapons because it takes a very, very long time to build up the military industrial capacity. So it's going to be money into the toilet, if you like. But secondly, it's falling into, it's accelerating away from failure and into another even bigger failure. They're painting the Russian bogey on the wall because they know that, well, maybe this will unite Europe and this will give us even more power and prevent the centrifugal forces and the nationalist forces from tearing us apart and removing our powers, basically.
Yeah, and I think I think when the EU started once, or the European, post World War II, it was a cooperation between the nation state, or the idea to reconstruct the nation state with the help of European trade and integration. But they were in symbiosis, they were working together. And it was necessary for the reconstruction of the nation state after the Second World War to have this cooperation. But the problem now is that it has been posed as in contradiction to the nation state. So trying to transfer power, you having decrees issued in Brussels that are counter to democracy and so on. So this tension between the nation state and the EU is not necessary. It's been created, and I think that's a major problem.
I don't follow your argument there. Sorry. Why has in a better world? It's probably gone too far now. Are you saying some kind of EU could have been created that did combine democracy and supranationalism?
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is that I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Splitting Europe, and I'm trying to trace the promise that European integration had, because after the Second World War, when all the European nation states were they were bombed to pieces, or they were shattered, their economies and so on, it was necessary to reconstruct those economies in a national frame, and they all tried to reconstruct it as it looked before the Second World War. So Britain tried to they wanted to have their sort of imperial trading patterns restored and so on. And France, and it was introducing tariffs and customs and things. But then there was a push from the US to integrate. And there was a lot of resistance in Europe. We don't want to integrate with each other. We just want to be, But it was necessary to have some form of trading, restoring European trade integration in order to reconstruct the nation states. So at that time, it was a solution to a real problem. But what has later evolved is, of course, that it's to become a union. It's become more and more supernatural in the sense that more and more laws are decided in Brussels outside of democratic control. Now we're at the point where it's also militarized, and it's deciding energy policy, and it's censoring media, it's censoring individual journalists from member states and so on. So we're in a completely different European Union now than was the idea then.
Well, as I said, my theory is that the East Europeans came and took over. A lot of them a lot of the people who were communists in 1989, no one was ever held to account. Maybe they shouldn't have been. We wouldn't have been better. We probably would have joined the machine, or I don't know. But the point is, they all became liberals. Literally, the people who were called communists, like say in Hungary, renamed themselves liberals and then became globalists. And communism is a kind of globalism or internationalism in a way. And then they infiltrated the Brussels institution. And people like Václav Klaus, who's a Czech Republic prime minister and a dissident during communism, said, all these people I used to oppose, they moved to Brussels, and now they're getting money from the state again. And I had a Polish girlfriend who was, her father was a communist apparatchik, and all her old communist apparatchik friends, the younger generation, they sought jobs inside the EU. Anyway, we're going to go into a break, and then we're going to bring on our next guest. We're going to have a panel discussion, and we're going to pivot over to the latest developments in Ukraine after the break.
Get your favorite merchandise from our official The Pulse shop. You'll find exclusive online t-shirts, mugs, hats, hoodies, and more at Pulse.today.
In 4 days. There was an old woman who lived in a shoe. She had so many children. She didn't know what to do.
Did you have a good day at school?
She gave them some broth without any bread.
There you go.
kiss them all soundly.
Night night.
Good night. And put them to bed. Hunger is a story we can end. End it at feedingamerica.org.
In sub-Saharan Africa, there is only one doctor for every 100,000 people, leaving people who have devastating medical conditions without the health care they desperately need. Since 1978, Mercy Ships has sent fully equipped floating hospital ships directly to people who would otherwise never meet a doctor or receive life-transforming surgery. Mercy Ships is made up entirely of volunteers from over 50 countries and also works to train local doctors and nurses to strengthen healthcare systems in the countries they serve. This year, Mercy Ships is launching their newest ship, the Global Mercy. This custom-built, state-of-the-art hospital ship will embark with hundreds of volunteers to help provide even more free life-changing surgeries to people in need. Learn how you can take part at mercyships.org.
Come on, let the man talk.
We never censor our hosts.
Good. Now, talk.
Uncensored news.
Free speech is alive and well on today's News Talk, The Pulse.
Welcome back to the Pelle Neroth Taylor Show. Well, we've got Ian Sörensen with us from before the break, and then Ian Proud, who's a friend, returning guest, a British diplomat who's written a lot. I won't do his whole CV here, but you can find him on the Peacemonger blog on Substack. Very, very good source for very well-written articles. He's on a lot of the alternative or independent media, YouTube podcasts, and he's also writes for Responsible Statecraft, which is an American sort of watering hole for political realists, who writes very good articles there and covers there's almost no dissenting point of view in the UK apart from that guy, Peter Hitchens, who's almost a comical sort of dissident in my view. He doesn't write, he says, of course, Putin is a tyrant, blah, 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 and then has a bit of criticism. He's a kind of controlled opposition in my view. Anyway, let's not get personal. Ian, you were writing an article for your Substack about Ukraine being sort of angling for funds to fund the next year and maybe 2026 and maybe 2027. What's going on? I thought they were going to try for peace with the Russians now, and there's a meeting in Istanbul ongoing as we speak.
Well, they need the money. There's a massive hole in their governmental finances, which is met and has been met since 2022 by injections of aid from Western donor countries. Defence spending accounts for 2/3 of their total government spending. And even if the war stopped tomorrow, it's not likely that Ukraine's military is going to go from a million people down to 80,000 people. It's going to stay militarized, and those huge costs are going to continue, maybe not at this exact same wartime level, but not much less than that for some years to come. And while that happens, somebody will need to provide them with the finances. Ukraine is in sovereign default. The only way it can get money is by printing money from its nationalized banking sector or handing out the begging bowl to Western donors, which, with Trump taking the position that he has, means us in the European community. I almost said European Union then, but I had to stop myself, remembering that I'm, of course, British and not European in that sense.
I thought, why he's talking about European community, but do you think that, this is coming down the turnpike then, this massive outlay. Starmer, meanwhile, in the UK, there's a lot of confusion about whether they are going to spend 3% on defense by 2034 or whatever it is. So, this is kind of cheese slicing. They're really worried about it, and he's rolled back, and you think, well, is it going to happen or not? But suddenly, and the UK is a really bad economic state, but these huge costs are coming down the turnpike, and we're not prepared for it, and no one's talking about it. So
we can't afford it. And in fact, every time Starmer makes any announcement, it's always the biggest ever this or the biggest ever that. He's talking about the biggest ever sustained increase in defence spending in the UK, which is actually a lie, because the big increase in defence spending happened under the Tories, largely caused by the support to war in Ukraine and also massive overspending on projects. So the Labour Party haven't actually brought much new money. They're offering essentially to provide 0.15% of GDP by 2027, 2 years, from now. They can't just dole out another 5 billion a year, 10 billion a year to kind of pop up Ukraine's budget. That's simply not going to happen. They're facing revolts already in respect of things like the winter fuel payments and other kind of cuts to government services. They have no money for this. And so they need to kind of have a cold shower and wake up to see that actually, ending the war is still going to carry a price tag for the UK, but actually it's still longer term going to be a cheaper option than this ridiculous situation we're in now, where we have our heads in the sand and say, fight on, come what may.
Well, Jens, what do you say? Is the Swedish public opinion prepared for the 2026 and 2027 costs coming down the motorway?
No, I don't think the public opinion is much part of this process at all. In any of the European countries, there is a lot of Russophobia and there's a lot of threat inflation and so on. So in the media, but I don't think the people are on board about what's actually implied by this. I think last time we said that there will be no social reforms, no welfare reforms for our children, for a whole generation. And instead we'll have a ranked up debt. So we're putting on a debt for, let's call it the democratic supermajority of the unborn Europeans, our children and so on. And they're going to pay that debt. And I think in a way, we also talked about it's a way of pushing coming Eurobonds, and then eventually you can put on direct taxation to Brussels, and you can increase centralization and so on. So I think there is some intent behind this as well, but it's not in the interest of any of the peoples of Europe, neither in Britain, Sweden, or Germany, or anywhere.
Well, I mean, Ian, we in our previous shows, we talked about Europe. I'm a recovering Europhile, and I guess you are as well. I mean, I liked Europe 20 years ago, and I think in your writings, you've talked about how much you were in favor of the European Union. Of course, you could be in favor of Europe without being in favor of the European Union. Has your view on the EU changed now that it's becoming kind of militarized and sort of falling forward, as it were, falling out of failure, accelerating out of the failure of the net zero and nationalist movements and into something even worse, perhaps?
Yeah, I've always had concerns about the democratic deficit of the European institutions. I always have. And for a long time, I described myself as a reluctant Remainer, because having grown up in Germany as a kid, crossing the border into the Netherlands for weekends or trips through actual hard kind of border, checkpoints, I really felt this much bigger sense of community from the opening up of borders and the removal of barriers between peoples of the countries of Europe. I found that a profoundly kind of important and helpful thing to kind of reduce the possibility of war by allowing people to meet, and so on. But as I said, when I was in Moscow for 4.5 years, I became less reluctant, briefly about the European project, because traveling from Moscow as a British diplomat into the European community, I felt that sense of community so much more. Every time I travel back into any European Union state, is almost a feeling of coming home. And that's a very real feeling for me, having suffered 24-hour surveillance living in Moscow. But unfortunately, the war in Ukraine has brought out the worst instincts of the European institutions. There's been this drive to an ever greater centralization of power. And nobody's elected any of these people. We've got these political pygmies, like Kaja Kallas, actually causing problems all around the world for Europe, not really kind of adding value, only adding cost and debt, to the supermajority of the future generation. And I think this is a deeply troubling thing. And there's also movements like, tampering and meddling in the elections, not just of European Union states, but of states outside of the European Union. For example, what happened in Georgia at the end of last year. Countries are slowly, reluctantly kind of ceding ever more sovereignty to the European institutions, which are not democratically accountable. And I think that's a very, very worrying trend.
And there's still a lot of controversy about what happened in Romania. Although Nawrocki in Poland seemed to have won. He looks like a carbon copy of the guy who won in Romania, Nicu Jordan, the same kind of globalist face, if you like. Sure, the European Union. I sometimes wonder. That everyone who knows says, oh, the Soviets won World War II and the Brits provided help, but there was the Soviets. Well, maybe the Russians are going to destroy the European Union in a way the British never managed to do, because it certainly brought out our differences. We're not. If you're a Spaniard or an Italian, you're not on board with this anti-Russian project that the Estonians feel so strongly about.
Exactly right. Sorry. Exactly right. And Vladimir Putin doesn't need to do anything, for the European Union project to fall apart. He can maintain this, low-level attritional warfare in Ukraine for some time to come, while the European Union gradually implodes upon its mounting pile of internal contradictions.
Both of you, what do you think of the latest attacks, the drone attacks? I mean, I've heard everything from a third of the Russian bomber fleet being destroyed to only 4 planes, only one of which has been irrevocably destroyed. What annoys me, though, we can have a good go at the Western media, is that they only ever quote Ukrainian sources. I mean, surely the first thing you learn in journalism school is that everyone lies in war, and you should quote both sides. And they always quote Ukrainian sources. I mean, I'm not dumb. I know exactly why they're doing that, because they're creating realities rather than reflecting them. But anyway, so the average Brit now thinks that Russia is on its last legs because its nuclear bomber fleet has been nuked or taken out. Which, I mean, anyway, what do you think? Do you think this is going to lead to escalation? How does it fit in with the Istanbul talks and all the rest of it? We'll start with you, Jens, maybe.
Well, I think we talked about before. I don't think that there is anyone in the West who wants peace. They want truce. I don't think Trump or the US ever wanted peace. They just wanted to scale it down and hand it over to the Europeans. Put the bill on the Europeans, and they need a truce, but not peace. And I think this attack, technically, I do believe that it needs to have Western intelligence in order to target and so on. So I think it has those traces. I don't think it's any way changing the course of the war or the military operation. The information I saw recently, and it may change, is that they tried to attack 5 sites and they managed 2 of them, and about 5 airplanes or something like that in those. That could change, of course, but will it lead to escalation? That's a question. I think there is an increasing pressure inside Russia to not just take it slowly, but then there is also a long strategy that the attrition strategy and the slow don't allow any provocations to change to a winning strategy. I think so. There is a balance there, of course.
Yeah, I'm thinking. If it is 5 to 10 bombers, they're obsolescent. And anyway, Russia's got missiles, and of course, Russians are taking out whole shiploads of Patriot missiles. Which the Western media doesn't talk about. But that big attack last weekend, they took out a lot of Western originated assets, and so we've got to put that on the other side of the ledger. I think that a lot of the accounts that are pro-Russian thought there was going to be an escalation. I didn't think this was going to lead to an escalation, precisely because Zelensky wants it, right?
There was also a civilian train, a bridge. And that may create some sensitivity inside Russia, that there's a lot of civilian targets being involved here as well.
Well, but anyway, Budanov, the head of Russian Ukrainian military intelligence, said that 18 months in preparation. So have they fired off all their sort of terrorist activities? If it takes 18 months to plan this, maybe they haven't got anything else up their sleeve, and the Russians know that. What do you think, Ian?
Well, it's a very complex operation that undoubtedly involved Western support in various ways. Of that, I'm absolutely sure. But the key thing is, actually, will it really change the facts on the ground of the war? No, it won't. It hasn't succeeded in derailing the talks in Istanbul that are happening today. Russia has played it remarkably cool, I think, actually, in not immediately kind of coming up with a knee-jerk reaction, to that. I think how much damage was caused is really details, frankly. I think in terms of the process, Zelensky probably wants to provoke some sort of Pearl Harbor moment. He's not going to get that sort of here. This painful for the Ukrainians kind of peace process is going to grind forward. It will develop its own life as it goes along and gains more oxygen. At some point, he will have to confront, the possibility of actually signing some sort of a truce. And it won't be peace, of course. I agree with Jens completely. Some sort of a truce that will look in the eyes of Ukrainian people as a capitulation, because it will have to confront issues around NATO sort of membership and things like that. And I think actually that the biggest blockage to a truce right now is this fear of failure and the repercussions from that both Zelensky faces, but also leaders in Western countries face too. I mean, they will suffer an enormous defeat when a truce is signed, because everything they've said over the past 3 years will be revealed to have been completely sort of not untrue, but sort of built on sand.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember the aftermath of the Iraq War, which was probably the last big self-reckoning of Europe's political and America's political elites. And that was bad enough, with people realizing that Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction, and that the intelligence agencies had lied about a lot of the evidence with complicit journalists and so on. And I think a lot of the things are going to come out that, I'm sorry to say, Ian, that the MI6 have been up to, the politicians and and maybe even, like, let's say, I mean, I talked to a guy who is former British protector of embassies, and he has many contacts in the Western intelligence community currently in Ukraine. And he says there's a sex trafficking scandal which goes up all the way into the Western political elites, and involving Ukrainian children or young, and then sort of used for blacks. So European equivalent to the Epstein scandal, Epstein used.
I mean, lots of Ukrainian refugee. I don't know the percentage of the total. It may be only a small percentage of the total, but a significant number of Ukrainian women refugees in some Western European countries, including Germany, are now working as prostitutes. I mean, that's even if it's only a small percentage of the whole, I'm quite sure that these things are happening, of course, and it's sad. Really.
And it's sad, and it's money laundering, sex, drugs. There's lots of allegations about all these leaders talking big words. They're sort of coked up half the time, So
just towering corruption as well. I mean, just
exactly.
Absolutely.
We're going back to Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, taking money off British. So all this swamp is going to be revealed. It's going to be revealed as a playground. I mean, which the intelligence agencies of Ukraine have used, of course, to blackmail, both to seduce and then blackmail politicians. And then, I mean, there's a scandal in Sweden, which you won't know about, Ian, where the Swedish national security guy had to leave because he'd been involved in sending naked pictures to other people. But his boyfriend was involved in a Ukrainian LGBTQ NGO, and they're both gay. And, it's all a swamp, and the Swedish press haven't really gone there. But,
there's a whole thing with Starmer and his front doors being burned down, by those Ukrainian rent boys as well. I mean,
that's so Starmer, right? And then you have the Swedish prime minister, and the rumors are circulating all over the net that he's gay. I mean, he's got a fake marriage or something. So it's like all these people are very, very devoted to this war in Ukraine, and part of it's emotional, but partly could be blackmail, or partly because something. I mean, I don't want to go there because of the legal ramifications, just for a show like this. But all these things might come out. So we're all our political class it's really important for them to do, and they're seeing it crumble before them. And what worries me is that they'll escalate rather than face reality. And do they have the power to escalate? I mean, it's incredible that we have these people with their fingers on the nuclear button, and we don't have parliamentary votes. There ought to be a kind of constitutional double lock or something against starting wars that could risk your country's existence and your humanity's existence. It's incredible. We have to sort these questions out, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean, the only country with the power to escalate is the United States of America.
Yeah, but do you think that the American? I mean, Jens, in a previous show, you were saying that the Americans are just trying to offshore they're using the Europeans to tie down the Russians, so that they could focus on the Chinese. So Trump is not a genuine guy. He wants to tie in. He wants to control the Europeans by keeping on buying American equipment, and then he wants to spend 5% of GDP, and then they can tie down Russia. And so he's playing a double game there. He's not the sort of peacemonger extraordinaire that the MAGA movement thinks. Do you agree with that? And then I had Gilbert Doctorov on Friday. He said, Trump is playing he has to play a very careful game because, he's just dismantled USAID. He's trying to shrink the State Department and everything. He's doing everything at the same time, but he's fighting the good fight. And he really is trying to take on these warmongers. Which interpretation would you veer towards?
I think there's a genuine intent there to kind of do good things, and I think he does some crazy things as well. Let's be clear. I'm not entirely convinced about what he's doing in the Middle East. Frankly, and I think his approach on tariffs has been frankly insane. But the biggest challenge he faces, but I think his intention on North Korea, on Russia, I think they're sincere. He wants to have doesn't necessarily mean he likes them, but he wants to have a more normal kind of relationship that reduces, the risk of conflict. But the biggest battle he faces is in the swamp itself. And that is the case today. That was absolutely the case back in 2017 when he came to power, the first time around. I mean, we're almost seeing a complete rerun of what happened in 2017. Trump says he wants to engage more with Putin. Lindsey Graham says, no, you can't do that. Let's have some big new sanctions law against Russia. Trump says, no, you can't do that. And the House says, yes, we can. And they do. And then US-Russia relationships go down the toilet. It almost feels slightly like Groundhog Day, right now with this new the secondary sanctions bill that Lindsey Graham has been pumping. And I don't only mean that in a very figurative sense, through right now. I mean, it's quite bizarre. So if Trump can't, from a stronger domestic political position now, than he was in 2017. If he can't break through that internal resistance within DC itself, then his prospects for success in Ukraine are doomed, to fail. That doesn't mean that his intentions aren't right. I think they probably are right, and I think they were right back in 2017. But he couldn't fight through the swamp then. Can he fight through it now?
Well, Ian, so what do you think? I mean, some people, if there was Western intelligence involvement in this latest attack, does it have to be? But could it be behind Trump's back? I mean, it's our common friend Ulla Tunander thinks it was going to turn out like the Bay of Pigs, where the CIA used the Cubans to drag. They hoped to drag in the American Army and Navy, and that didn't happen because Kennedy said no when it happened, and the rebels died on the beach, as it were. Is the CIA sitting in Kiev trying to drag Trump in by giving intelligence assistance to these drone attacks?
Well, I mean, it could certainly be behind Trump's back, because the CIA, they run programs, and I mean, they have their start programs and so on without even sometimes even the head of the CIA may not even know about some of the programs all the time. So that could happen. Things are just operating. But that doesn't mean that I think I disagree with the idea that Trump is trying to fight the swamp and he's a peacemaker and he's just failing. It could be, it's possible, but in that case he's a failed. We had Joe Biden. It was like Weekend with Bernie's or something, and then we have another. President who is incapable of controlling the Europeans, incapable of controlling the Israelis, incapable of controlling even his own administration. So in that case, it doesn't matter. But I don't think so. I think there are strategy papers by his advisors, Wes Mitchell, which is called Sequencing the Wars, which is talking about handing the Russia conflict over to the Europeans. There are strategy and documents from Rand Corporation about extending Russia and so on. So you have a documented strategy about passing over the war costs to the Europeans and also binding the Europeans closer into subservience of the United States, but maintaining the empire. And I think the idea of dismantling the USA idea and so on, well, it's about modernizing what used to be called soft power. There is no dismantling of the National Endowment for Democracy projects or those former so-called operation where you try to support regime oppositional agents and so on. That's still in place. It was defunded for a month and then refunded again. So what has been done there is a modernization. Back in the 1970s, it was good to have Radio Free Europe as a propaganda channel. Today you don't need it because you got social media, so you have a different landscape. So it's about reforming the whole thing. We don't need those type of programs, so we can get rid of those. Stuff that was done in what used to be called the Global South can be sort of reorganized and done cheaper or done in a different way. So I believe it's a reorganization rather than trying a genuine attempt to detente.
Well, I hope you're wrong, I have to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's a very, very valid, very interesting angle. But do you think, well, how could Trump prove his bona fides to you, Jens? Get something like stopping intelligence and pulling out of Ukraine completely?
Yeah, he could stop this in one day. He could stop he could stop what's going on in Gaza with one telephone call. But he's supporting that apparently. How come he has all these figures that are neocons around him? The Kellogg's. Why is he there? Or the Sebastian Gorkas, or even Pete Hegseth as a defense minister talking about the EU, Europeans having to spend more money on NATO, which is the very reason why we're having a conflict with Russia. How come he's surrounded himself by all those people? Is it just incompetence? Is it just that nobody? Yeah, it is possible, but in that case, he's irrelevant.
We've got to slowly wind up here, but Ian, I mean, my stock answer would be something like, you've got to be a political realist, so he can't take on the Jewish lobby in America to say it once, and he isn't backing Netanyahu all the way, and he has to deal with the Ukraine war first because it's more important, and then he's got to keep some neocons on board because he has to keep balance, or keep the neocons happy with Kellogg, who doesn't have all that much power but keeps the Europeans happy. What's your thought? Do you think that Trump is foolish to keep on these neocons, Ian, or is it part of this political calculation, or is he really a wolf in sheep's clothing, as Jens says?
But I think he's shown a lack of decisiveness in moderating or balancing sort of those different constituencies. And actually, you look back in history, this is kind of a common trend among sort of powerful dictator type figures are always kind of spinning the plates of the different political constituencies that they have to deal with, and he's no different. That doesn't necessarily explain why he can't pull the plug on Ukraine, rather than how he kind of manages the internal dynamics of the Beltway, itself. But I think actually, I'm not sure that because of the nature of his personality that he spends enough focused time on the issues. He just kind of drops, in and out. I mean, if he were more decisive, for example, on Ukraine, saying, "Well, look, categorically, Ukraine is not going to, join NATO, and that should be taken off the table," that would fundamentally shift the dynamics of the negotiation process. If he were categorically to say that all intelligence and military aid, even if it's just logistic support, is to be withdrawn, not on a temporary basis, but from here on in, that would, dramatically kind of shift the dynamics of the negotiation process. It's his lack of decisiveness, which is the problem, which may be a feature of just the nature of his presidency, or just maybe a feature of his personality and his way of working. But I mean, I think that for me is a big kind of sticking block. He's not really committing.
Yeah, certainly cutting aid off. I mean, that was Hegseth, the defense secretary, did that in February, and then Trump reinstated it, I think. Anyway, we've got to end there, gentlemen. Thank you very, very much for a very interesting and rewarding three-way panel for the second half and the first half. Just talking to Jens about censorship in Europe. Thank you so much. This is the Pelle Neroth Taylor Show. Be back after the break.